Just who was President Thomas Jefferson? Good evening, I'm Linda Laurel. Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. He was a founding father, an author of the Declaration of Independence, and the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. Some say he is the most overexposed president, but the least understood. In the New York Times #1 bestseller, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, Pulitzer Prize winning author Jon Meacham draws on original research chronicling Jefferson's life from birth to his last days. Tonight, to help us decode this enigma of a man, we are very pleased to welcome executive editor and executive vice president at Random House, national political commentator, and the author himself, Jon Meacham. As always, leading our discussion, our hosts, David Jones and Gary Polland.
Well, David, obviously, this is a really nice guest to have, and Jon is a brilliant author. I know everybody tells you that, but my first
not enough.
Well, okay, well now,
he's mostly a morning Joe guy.
Yeah,
but that's another network.
And we're on a Friday night, 7:30.
I understand.
I wanted to ask you about Thomas Jefferson and your take on the type of leader he was at that point in that era, and how does he compare to what we've got now?
What we've got now. You know, he was a deal maker, ultimately, which we don't wrote or spoke in more needlepoint pillow terms than Thomas Jefferson. Everything he said was eloquent. You could put it on the wall. You could put it, on a plaque. But those philosophical convictions, so brilliantly expressed, were part of a pragmatic political sensibility. This is a man who seemed to champion small government, who seemed to champion the rights of states over a federal government, who bought Louisiana with the stroke of a pen. If Alexander Hamilton had tried to do that, I'm going to use a technical historical term here, Thomas Jefferson's head would have exploded. But because Jefferson was doing it, he saw it as all right. My own sense is that Jefferson did see politics as a necessary evil. There was no other way to handle the affairs of a republic. He believed that the American Republic was the political manifestation of this incredibly important ideological change going on in the West, from which the divine right of kings, of popes, of prelates were changing, and that liberty was suddenly not simply the gift from above, it's not simply the gift of a person, but from above, and it was therefore inviolate.
Henry Adams, who wrote a couple of volumes that you probably used to help you out in yours, said about Jefferson that he was sort of awkward and a little bit distant and maybe a little stiff. And of course, we know he wasn't much of a speaker. So
he wasn't.
Did he force himself to be a good politician? Because it sounds like he had some weaknesses there.
That's a great question. He was shy and somewhat awkward. The public speaking part is interesting because in that era, they didn't really give speeches. They didn't have Lincoln-Douglas debates. What would have been the largest audience a political figure like Jefferson would ever have addressed would have been a legislative assembly. So when Patrick Henry gave his great speeches, he wasn't really doing them out in the town square. He was doing them inside the House of Burgesses. John Adams actually thought that Jefferson's inability to get up in a legislative assembly and give a speech helped him politically, because no one ever had their mind changed by being told they were wrong by someone. So Jefferson, as being the man who would be on the committee, who would write the statement of the committee, exercised a level of control. I would argue that his capacity to write well and quickly was the moral equivalent of FDR mastering the radio or JFK and Reagan mastering television. It was the way of mastering the means of mass communication, because he was writing the statements, Declaration of Independence, among many others, that went out and shaped the political life.
And that other Adams that you just mentioned said that he was 10 times as a writer that he was, which was one of the reasons he yielded to him to write the Declaration of Independence.
Right, and if you know anything at all about John Adams, you know that for him to have said that was like having a molar pulled out with a pair of 18th century pliers. John Adams did not yield to many men in self-regard. But he did see that Jefferson was a more vivid writer. There were a couple of reasons, interesting reasons, about the Declaration. You know, now we think of the Declaration as a red, white, and blue, as this iconic document. It was a political manufacture. Adams had been advised that Massachusetts was seen as too forward-leaning, was too radical. Virginia was the biggest colony, the central colony, and it was sort of more, it was as if you were asking the political middle to lead on independence as opposed to a more extreme group in Massachusetts. And so Adams wisely wanted Jefferson to do it.
John, why did you decide to write the book about Jefferson?
Because I like politicians. It's one of my many, many character flaws. I think that I admire those who will suffer the slings and arrows of public life. There's no other way for us to conduct our public life. If we don't find people who are good and willing to do it, then we better hope we get a king whom we really like. And that's never worked out, really, in human history. So my sense was, when I started this, right after writing about Andrew Jackson, and temperamentally you could not find two more different men, was that politics in 2008, 2009, and certainly that trend has continued unto this hour, was a depressed market. You know, we don't value people who are in politics. People in politics seem to be in it really even more than ever for ideological purposes as opposed to making things work. And here's Thomas Jefferson, who had as clear an ideology as any American who ever lived, but who understood that as a pragmatic matter, as a practical matter, if you're going to make a country work, you had to be willing to compromise. You had to be willing to give the other guy his point every once in a while. And not to be too grand about it, but I think that if we think of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, George Washington, these great figures who sometimes seem so distant and so austere and so perfect, if we realize that they were flesh and blood human beings, they were flawed, they were sinful, they cut deals, they were not always perfect, they had their political weaknesses, and yet they left the country a little bit better or a lot better off, then that should redeem politics to some extent.
So it sounds like that you are contributing in your own way to the myth of American exceptionalism, in a sense. Or maybe.
Well, myth is an interesting word.
Yeah.
Is that myth as story or myth as a false story?
Or is it, well, it's called I think they called you a member of the flawed giant school of historians.
Yes. Well, certainly the flawed is part. Flawed is true.
No, you pick these giants,
I do.
and then are the present day pygmies elevated? Because Jon Meacham has scored points by showing us how great even the flawed ones were in 1800.
That's a good question. Let me answer it this way. My view is, if we look up at people in the past adoringly, or if we look down on them condescendingly, we never learn as much as if we try to look them in the eye. And if you look them in the eye, are they flawed giants? Absolutely. Because these were, in fact, human beings who, in the great drama of the West, bent history in a certain direction. Are the people and politicians of the present hour, are they pygmies? I think that's premature. I think they're human beings. I think they are people who, I hope, at their best, are trying to bend history to their will in the right direction. Does that dignify or somehow condone political chicanery? I don't think so. That's just the natural part of it. I just think that if we expect everybody to be perfect, we've learned from Genesis forward that's not going to be a particularly satisfactory view.
Kind of unrealistic. But one of the things you wrote about in the book, you talked about, I thought, a critical quote: politics is a kaleidoscope constantly shifting, and the morning's foe may well be the afternoon's friends. Right. And when I read that in your book, and I thought about the present state of politics today, I said, I don't think that applies to many people in Washington.
It doesn't. And you know, Winston Churchill, I wrote a book about him and Franklin Roosevelt 10 years ago now. I really learned that watching Churchill, because he could be so magnanimous. No one was nicer, no one was more solicitous of Neville Chamberlain than Winston Churchill. And I kept wondering why. You know, and Churchill had this remarkable capacity to be slapped down by FDR or slighted and yet bounce back up like one of those clown bop bags and kept coming. And I wondered, what was that? And what it was a man who had spent 50 years in the British Parliament and had changed parties 3 times. As he once put it, anyone can rat, but it takes character to re-rat. So I think that when you look back, pick an hour where we have been in one place and we needed to get to another. You will find that flawed people, some of whom have turned out to be giants. The Civil Rights Bill of 1964. This is a good example. We needed that bill. Lyndon Johnson had gutted the Civil Rights Bill. Your former senator had gutted the Civil Rights Bill of 1957. He wanted to get 64 through, so he did everything he could. Now, was that hypocrisy? Had he had a genuine change of heart? It kind of doesn't matter, because he got to the right place.
And he didn't mind meeting and talking with politicians. So I guess we could say
or
that,
the other party, for that matter.
That's right. I guess we could say that Thomas Jefferson is actually closer to an LBJ than he is to a Barack Obama, who famously here doesn't like anyone.
Unquestionably. There's a story that Lamar Alexander, the senator from Tennessee, tells about Everett Dirksen, the Senate Minority Leader, during the 64 bill. Another senator sitting in Dirksen's hideaway office at 5 o'clock one afternoon. The phone rings. Dirksen answers it. Dirksen says, "Oh, Mr. President, I can't come down tonight. I've got to get home. I promised the wife." And he hangs up. And Johnson had wanted him to come down. Before Dirksen can get out of the office, he hears barking in the hallways, and it's Johnson with his beagles. Johnson, when Dirksen hung up, had gotten out of the Oval Office, gotten in the car, and driven up to see him anyway. That is impossible to imagine Barack Obama getting out of the Oval Office and doing that. Jefferson did believe in the politics of personal relationships, what FDR once called the science of human relationships. Every night when Congress was in session, he had dinner at the White House with a group. It would be all of one party or all of the other. He was not a utopian about this. He didn't believe that we would all be singing Kumbaya, but he did believe that it was harder to reflexively oppose someone with whom you had spent time than it would have been otherwise.
But John, he was also, I'm not taking this from the book, and I'm not going to give you examples, and you can certainly slap me around after you hear this.
That's good.
He was also a scheming manipulator.
Sure.
And he even did his best to undermine George Washington.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a very strange man, really.
Well, is that strange? Or he came to believe that George Washington had become a tool of the party in the United States that was favoring Britain to the point of endangering the American experiment. He believed the guiding political reality of Thomas Jefferson's life in the early republic was a fear that the British would come back. Here's why that's a legitimate view. They did.
Right.
In 1812. So would you want a friend or a colleague who was cheerful to your face and then wrote letters about you behind your back? No. But I know I've had those, and I suspect you all have too. So did George Washington. Does that make Jefferson somehow a lesser person or lesser human being? I don't think so. I think it makes him more accessible.
But describe the deal of 1790, where he meets Hamilton outside the door.
Right.
And wasn't that perhaps one of the most significant events in American history?
Well, it was 1790 exactly, and they were in Lower Manhattan. It wasn't really seen as Lower Manhattan then, but on the tip of Manhattan, where the national capital was. Jefferson had just returned from France and become the Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton is Secretary of the Treasury. John Adams is Vice President. George Washington is President. Not bad. Pretty good team, all in all. Hamilton is outside very frustrated because he can't get a key piece of financial legislation passed that he believes that would make the federal government more of a part of the life of the nation. And Jefferson says, well, what's the problem? And it turns out that James Madison wants the capital down on the Potomac, not on the Susquehanna, not on the Hudson. And so Jefferson convened a dinner and brought Madison and Hamilton together. The three of them sat there, and they cut a deal where Madison agreed, we'll assume the state debts, we'll give Hamilton what he wants, but we want the capital on the Potomac. And there it was. Now,
and Hamilton gets the power to tax in order to pay off that debt.
He gets, and it sets in motion a national financial system that Jefferson ideologically, here we are, this is the example. Philosophically, Jefferson, no one was more eloquent at arguing against that kind of thing. And yet, he believed that it would strengthen the federal government, which he actually knew from his own experience as a member of the Confederation Congress in the 1780s, where they couldn't even find a place to meet. They couldn't get a quorum to do that. He was a nationalist. As time went on and nationalism became more associated with the Federalists and his enemies, he didn't want to emphasize that. But you have to watch, I think with everyone, but with Jefferson in particular, you have to watch what he did, not what he said. And what he did was he was constantly about strengthening the national government. Not consistently, but age to age, he was about authority that would in fact enable us to act out the pursuit of happiness, his phrase from 1776.
If we had Jefferson on the panel with you today and we'd ask him what was his most significant accomplishments in his life, what do you think he would tell us?
I think he'd pick the three that are on the tombstone, which is the authorship of the Declaration of Independence, authorship of the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, and the father of the University of Virginia. Now, you know, generations of people, since he died in 1826, have said, oh, how humble it is. He didn't mention he was president. He guaranteed that everyone would say, oh, how humble, by not putting it there. I think it's one of the world's great passive-aggressive epitaphs. But look at if you look at those three achievements, you see liberty of conscience, you see human equality, the promise of it, if not the reality, and enlightened education. What Jefferson knew was that in his political life, the things he had done would always be controversial. We are still fighting. At this hour, we are fighting about a Hamiltonian and a Jeffersonian point of view, at least as those are broadly understood. Hard to get up movements against liberty of conscience, human equality, and enlightened education. So I think that he would see those as critical, and that those were important tributaries, important feeders of the kind of Republican, lowercase r, virtue that would make a country like this work.
And I just read a little piece from the book in the part about the notes on the state of Virginia, where he mentions, I'm just going to use a phrase here, describing slavery as the most unremitting despotism.
Right.
I think you mentioned in the book, or in an interview with someone, I believe it was, that you know, it was sort of, you were sort of disheartened by Jefferson having abandoned what was in an early part of his life an effort to get rid of slavery, and that he finally just gave up. Was there a sense of that in his writings, or is that Jon Meacham interpretation?
No, it's clear. If Thomas Jefferson had fallen off a horse in 1785, he would have been a source of quotations for William Lloyd Garrison and the other emancipators and abolitionists in the 19th century. As a young trial lawyer, as a young Burgess of Virginia, as a member of the Confederation Congress, he tried on several occasions to reform the institution. He was not an abolitionist, let's be clear, but he was in the forefront of changing the institution in ways that would have ultimately undermined his interest as a slave owner. He lost each time. He realized it was politically untenable. And if I'm right, that he was in fact quintessentially a political creature, then he made a calculation at that point that it was not going to happen in his time. It was a very un-Jeffersonian thing to do. Here's a man who is really the architect of the, more so than Washington, more so than Adams, of the politics of optimism, talking about how the American journey was like a cloud of light coming over the continent, and where it stopped, no one would know. He said of Americans, whatever they can, they will, except when it came to slavery. And ultimately, his own self-interest, his own economic self-interest, and his political read of what was possible led him to become a defender and perpetuator of an institution that he knew to be morally wrong.
And what about the possibilities? This just occurred to me, so, you know, give me a break here.
Sure.
What about the possibilities that he gave up? Because about the time that he gave up, he also had a mistress and several children. And perhaps he did not want to bring any more attention to him on that issue than what was already being spoken of.
Right. I think that it's all of a piece. And he was deeply concerned, like many planters who perpetuated this incredibly tragic system, evil system. He was always afraid of exposure. He was afraid of losing the fundamental control over his universe, both personally and economically. He really ultimately couldn't envision a world like our world, where blacks and whites and people of color lived in an integrated way, even though he was creating, as you suggest, just such a world
They still had shame back in that time, too. I mean,
sure. You know, the question of miscegenation is a complicated one. It was a world of desire and denial. His relationship with Sally Hemings lasted 40 years. It was the longest relationship with any woman in his life. Relationship, connection, the nomenclature is tricky here. Hemingses were the only slaves he freed in his will. Sally Hemings herself was allowed to leave Monticello after he died and lived in Charlottesville unaccosted. It's a complicated story, but what isn't complicated is that it was perpetuated by a white power structure, of which Thomas Jefferson, after an early crisis of conscience, decided to defend, because ultimately it was more comfortable for him to defend it than to do the right thing.
Let's talk a little bit about current politics, because, you know, reading your book and thinking about the way things were then with the giant that Jefferson was and the politics of today, it's like two different worlds. Yeah. And I wanted to get your present take on, is there any hope that the parties in Washington can actually compromise, work together to advance the country's interests? And I don't mean by compromise meaning giving Barack Obama everything he wants, which I believe is his theory. Yeah. And don't expect them to do the same thing to us. Is there any hope?
Right. Well, there's always hope. The problem is there's not a political incentive right now for there to be that kind of compromise. What's incentivized is a kind of purist stance in which lawmakers in particular who don't have particularly competitive districts really fear a primary challenger more than a general election challenger. And I don't want to put the whole thing off on the House of Representatives, but that's a big reality. You know, I'm working on a book about George Herbert Walker Bush, your former congressman from here, and it's amazing to look. This was just 45 years ago, almost half a century ago. He went to Congress in 1967. And the amount of time he spent with lawmakers of both parties, going to the House gym, playing basketball, the picnics, the hamburgers, more hamburgers were grilled in those backyards than you could possibly imagine. It created an ethos where you would give the other guy something 10% of the time, which is really what we're talking about. We're not talking about, again, a kingdom of God world where everything is 50-50. That's never going to happen. Shouldn't happen. But 10%, 5% of the time, you have to be willing to give the other side a vote. And I think you're much more likely to make that happen if you know them.
Each side sort of has, in using Jefferson's expression, that they have the wolf by the ear and can't let go.
Right.
And that's what he said about slavery, and it ended up being a civil war that ended up solving the problem. So how bad could this actually go, do you think?
Well, it's funny you should say that. People often say, you know, has it ever been worse? And I'll say the Civil War was pretty bad. You know, I think we did see in moments of national calamity, we have seen that for ever briefer periods of time, there are periods of unity that come after that. And sometimes you get things that you don't necessarily want in that kind of dramatic period. One never wishes for a crisis. One never wishes for an existential moment where things are so difficult. But we've had two in the last 10 years. We were attacked here at home in 2001, and we had a terrible economic crisis in 2008, 2009. I think that historically we will look back and try to figure out why partisanship ultimately increased after those moments of crisis as opposed to decreased. Whereas in the earlier part of the century, Pearl Harbor, the consciousness-raising events of the Civil Rights Movement, Sputnik, created moments of a bit longer unity. And I think there are some structural reasons for it. I think the media plays, social media.
Blame TV.
Blame TV. Well, TV now is like, you know, a literary quarterly compared to Twitter, you know.
That's true.
I mean, you all are the great graybeards.
Well, John,
Yes,
time is up.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for being on the show, the author of the new book out on paperback, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. It is a wonderful read, Linda, and we certainly commend it to our viewers.
It's fascinating to have this historical perspective, and we're so honored to have you here with us. Thank you so much. And remember, you can catch Red, White, and Blue every Friday at 7:30 p.m. right here on Channel 8, and again Saturdays at 6:30 p.m. We also invite you to visit us online and send us your comments. We want to hear what you are saying about the issues that affect Houston. You can submit your comments at houstonpbs.org or on Facebook, and while you're there, don't forget to like us. We thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again next week. Good night.